contemplate that and see how that feels in your body. Does that feel better than being at war with the ego? Does that feel better than having this sort of ego/heart division, like supposedly hard kind of wired into your body? Does it feel better to think like, I don't have to reject this part of myself? I can actually be friends with it. I can actually see that it's useful and even put it to use and know that it's actually helping with my soul mission here. Hi, friends, and welcome to this episode of the New Humans for New Earth podcast. Here, we talk about the great transition into New Earth that we are all living through, and we share wisdom, perspectives, and information to support and inspire you in making more aligned choices in your life. We're here to help co-create New Earth, so let's talk about it. Before we dive into this episode, thank you for taking a moment to hit subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast. In this moment of great transition, messages of hope, love, kindness, compassion, and unity, and stories about people who are helping to build a better future are so important. Hitting subscribe is a free and easy way to help this podcast reach others like you who are here to help co-create New Earth. From my heart to yours, thank you. In last week's episode, me and my bestie, Gabe Torres, spoke about judgment, and in particular, what it might look like to refrain from judgment in this sort of moment when there's so much us versus them, they need to do better, screw them sort of energy floating around. And there were a couple of moments during the episode where we were sort of contemplating what it would be like to sit down with some of these people who are on sort of the receiving end of some of this energy and these comments, namely the billionaires, right? And in those moments where we were contemplating what it would be like to sort of sit human to human and say, hey, let's figure this out together, we both sort of ended up laughing. There was a sense in which the laughter sort of, I think, acknowledged some of the feeling of the absurdity and even the futility of trying to do that, right? I think there is this collective sort of sense of attempting to reason, attempting to convince, attempting to sort of come to a mutual and mutually beneficial understanding with some of these folks is futile. And we can just see that. I think, right, the thinking is we can just see that by how they're behaving, by the decisions they're making, the business decisions, by some of the ways that they treat their workers, for instance, right? And there's just sort of this accumulation of decisions and behaviors that I think we all sort of see and say, it is not worth our time to even try to talk with these people. And I just want to say right here, right now, like, that position resonates with me for sure. But I think there's another sort of reason why we both burst out laughing in those moments. And that reason is that when you're engaging with someone who is so deep in, I'll say, a materialistic viewpoint, who's so deep in the rational mind, who's so deep in sort of identity with their ego, and we'll sort of talk more a little bit about what that means in a second, then again, this sense of futility in attempting to engage in that person in sort of a deeper, more heart-centered way. And I think the sort of the origin of that sense, or like the source of that sense of the futility, is like, you guys aren't even living in the same world. You're not even operating with remotely the same sort of worldview. And so you're just kind of inherently going to be talking past one another. And, if you've ever sort of, if you've ever tried to have a productive conversation with a person whose worldview is just so distant from yours, I mean, I think we're all familiar with the frustration that leads to. And I think this idea, and I agree with this, you cannot force someone to wake up who's not ready to wake up, who's not willing to wake up. You can't heal someone who doesn't want to be healed. And I think nonetheless, there's like the impulse to have this conversation, the hope that we can have this conversation kind of is grounded in the fact that like the decisions that some of these people are making and have the power to make impact us all. And it impacts every single one of us. And so, if we're not able to be able to communicate and say, hey, friend, I understand you have a business to run. I understand that your motivation is to increase your profit. I understand that, you don't seem to be concerned with the impacts on the environment from your business or the impacts to other humans, to your business, right? I understand that your number one priority is your bottom line. Got it. But your actions impact all of us. And your actions have an outsized impact here on all of us. And so we need to be able to have this conversation. That's sort of this like human to human hope and dream that I think sort of motivated some of that conversation. If you're laughing, scoffing maybe in the background as you're hearing me say this, like, again, that's that sense of futility. But I want to sort of push on this a little bit more. And particularly sort of this sense of the distance between sort of this like more ego-centered sort of viewpoint of the world and what we might refer to as more of like a spiritual or heart-centered sort of way of approaching this reality. And as seems to happen more and more in my life, sort of as I progress on my journey, a few days after recording that episode with Gabe, I found myself reading a book that I think sort of pointed the way to sort of continuing this conversation, and particularly to sort of understanding that gap between sort of this more like ego-centered sort of way of understanding and approaching reality versus a more sort of spiritual or heart-centered sort of understanding of this reality. But that's not to say that this book had, quote unquote, the answers, right? I actually felt like this book, it was a really nice example of just how deeply sort of ingrained and entrenched this communication divide is. And I'm not going to sit here and do like, an oral book report by Queenie, like, as fun as that sounds. I'm also not going to bother to sort of share the name of the book or the spiritual teacher. Like, I'm not wanting or intending this to be sort of, a takedown by Queenie. Like, that is not my style. And, frankly, it doesn't matter because this sort of energy and attitude that this book exemplified for me is frankly very pervasive, and I mean, it could be because of this book. I don't know. But I think what I'm going to get to is actually that it's just kind of higher level egoic sort of thinking. So a little preview, and I'll just say as well, it's like, I'm not going to name this person, but like, you've probably heard their name. Let me just put it that way. Okay. Which I think gives you a sense of just how entrenched and familiar this attitude and approach is. And as we get into it, I think you'll be like, yeah, I mean, I've heard that, I've thought of that, like I've seen stuff like that. And like, it's just so mundane in the spiritual conversation. And I think it's really unhelpful. And now that I've done all this buildup, what you talking about now, Queenie? So the thing that really struck me about this book was it kept talking about the ego as pathological or insane, mad. And I just don't think that that's productive. I mean, we see this sort of similar kind of attitude in when people say, like, you have to kill your ego. leave your ego behind, right? Like starve it. And there's just this underlying sense of the ego is bad. The ego is a mistake. The ego is something that we are fighting with, and that, like, we're not entirely sure how the ego came to be or how it came to be so sort of pervasive and entrenched in our reality, but like that is bad. And, what we need to do urgently is to like dig the ego out of our psyche, out of our culture, and like dump it. And again, like, I don't disagree with some of the sentiments here, but I disagree with the divisiveness and the violence and frankly, the judgment that is sort of baked into all of this. So, what do I mean by the ego? I think this is a word that gets thrown around a lot. And it has sort of, I'll say folksy, sort of colloquial kind of meanings and usages. It has more of a like technical kind of term of art sort of meaning and usage, kind of in psychology, right? And we kind of like play with these intentionally or unintentionally, sort of in our conversations and in sort of the spiritual conversation. I don't want to get overly technical about what the ego, quote unquote, is, right? But I will say that when I think of the ego, I think of a few things, right? I think about rational thought. I think about living in the mind. I think about sort of over-identification with our thoughts, right? So this has some roots in, I mean, I've mentioned this before, but like Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am. My identity is bound up with what is going on in my mind. Other sort of things that come up with the ego is like just being so kind of in your own perspective that shapes sort of and defines like the whole of reality for you, to the exclusion, frankly, of like the possibility of other perspectives. I mean, and if you kind of like go far enough down that line, you get kind of what we talk about often as narcissism. When I think about the ego, I also think about, sort of this defensiveness that comes in. The ego doesn't like to be wrong. And so, it's entrenched in its own viewpoint, and to the extreme sort of position where if it is confronted with contrary evidence, oftentimes what the ego will do is it will reject that and explain it away. And, sometimes to the point of saying like, that was a hallucination. Whoever said that was crazy, because the ego is like so fragile, frankly, that it can't contemplate stuff that doesn't fit into its worldview. There is no space for it in the sort of ego's like understanding of reality. This all kind of falls into sort of the shadow side of the ego. And like, let's just remember that there's light and dark to everything, right? So I think one of the things that we kind of overlook with the ego is like, it gets formed in part as a result of like your lived experience, your biography. And that's beautiful. The particular flavor of human that you are, your interests, your experiences, your skill set, the things that get you excited, right? Like, these are all also like part of your ego as well. Talking about the ego in this way, pathological, insane, kill it, starve it, it's not helpful. And I kind of see this on like two levels. I mean, to just ground this into like some practical experience, right? I mean, in my own like healing journey and also sort of observing others, what I see is in these moments where, you've kind of gotten a little bit of like a peek into sort of where your ego's been leading you wrong. And maybe wrong is even too judgy, but like, I think we can all resonate with or all have had experience where we realize that maybe a trauma or, there's almost these like systematic misunderstandings that our egos like draw us into. And, in those moments when we see it, oftentimes there's kind of this like shame spiral that almost can start happening with folks, right? There's this like, how did I not see that? How have I been walking around this world in my life, like systematically having this misunderstanding over and over and over again? And I just like, I didn't see it. Did other people see it? Like, am I the only one who didn't understand that this was going on? And there's this embarrassment that can come up for folks a lot of the time. It almost reminds me, I mean, I don't know if you guys have been around kids, but there's this thing that happens at about 7 years old, as far as I've observed, right? Where it's like suddenly they just get a little more self-awareness and a little more sort of clued in to the fact that other people sort of have reactions to their behaviors and it's not always positive, And so there's this like massive wave of like self-consciousness that happens, like self-consciousness in a bad way. Maybe not bad, but in in an embarrassed way. Like suddenly they're afraid to be seen. Suddenly they're afraid to like talk to adults, right? Because they don't want to do the annoying thing that they suddenly kind of have a sense that they've been doing all this time that no one said anything about. So in this moment, when you get these peaks through the ego and you get these like sort of more expanded sort of perspective on your own behavior or your own perception of reality, there's this opportunity for the ego to get reactivated and almost re-entrenched. Because when we feel that, when we notice that, when we start questioning, like, how have I been doing this? The ego wants to say, hey, you're good. That insight that you just had, you don't need to listen to that. That's like listening to that way leads to embarrassment, and we don't like that. That way leads to being wrong, and we are not about that. Right? What you need to do in this moment is to be ashamed and scared and like back away from that and come back into the nice warm security of your ego because we keep you safe. And that's ultimately what the ego is trying to do, is just to keep you safe. And then this world where there's all kinds of, name a few examples. I don't need to get into it. There's all kinds of things that make it feel like we need to be safe. And so the ego is actually trying to be our friend. So as I said, there's this opportunity for the ego to get re-entrenched in these moments. And if you come at it saying, yeah, and you're pathological, yeah, you've been wrong this whole time, yeah, you're an idiot for having been seeing and understanding the world this way, you should be ashamed, run away from the ego, that's just going to cause the ego's defenses to rise up even further and get even more ingrained. And what does that mean? That means that that person, or you, if we're talking about you, in this moment when you're having sort of this insight and this opportunity to grow and expand and heal, suddenly there's threat to whether or not that's actually going to happen for you. And so what I've experienced, what I've seen happen, is that in that moment, instead of attacking the ego and saying, yeah, you are wrong. Yeah, you should be embarrassed. No, you say, it makes sense that you would have thought that. It makes sense that you were doing that. It makes sense that you were understanding the world this way, or that, you were approaching relationship this way. And it does. It does. Because if you are a person who's had all the experiences that you've had, and you have your ego identity that you had, then of course you were perceiving and understanding the world and the way that you were. And now that you're having this sort of peak, this little expanded sort of perception, now you have the opportunity to say, oh, like, I don't have to anymore. I can just kind of step out of that and into this new sort of perception of reality, this more expanded sort of awareness and understanding. And the energy of that just feels a little kinder, doesn't it? Now, why does this matter? I think if we kind of look at this from an expanded perspective on what's going on here, and by here I mean this planet, by here I mean with human consciousness and the human species, the evolution of human consciousness, this moment, this transition into new earth, which is just this like us collectively stepping into this next moment of human evolution, then I think we can actually come to understand sort of the ego and why it exists in the first place. Before I jump too far in, I mean, how I understand the ego and our relationship to it is less as something that we need to defeat, as less of something that needs to be killed and extracted, and more as something that we need to sort of come into right relationship with. If you think about the light aspects of the ego, if you think about sort of all of the gifts that we've been given as a result of the ego, you can kind of come to have some more appreciation for it, right? I mean, to go back to this, like the ego is pathological thing, let's step back from that a little bit. But I will grant you that where we have gotten to as a result of sort of the collective action of the ego is pathological, in the sense that because of sort of the collective operation of the ego, we've gotten to a place where we are massively harming our environment. Totally. And we don't need to go into all the details of all of that. I think you know. We all know. Right. And I think the sort of the underlying sort of logic for that is that the ego can't contemplate or doesn't have space for sort of anyone else's sort of needs or priorities besides its own. Right. There is a very real sense in which to the ego, no one else really exists. Other people, animals, the planet, whatever, right? Like if you are fully entrenched in the ego, you are fully like immersed in your own perspective, and you can't truly understand, or like there isn't truly room for other people, other beings, a collective, or sort of the concept of like collective harmony or collective well-being. There is just you. And the result of that is crisis, is environmental collapse. I mean, we hear now, we see it. But if you take seriously this idea that there are no mistakes, then the situation that we're in and the fact of the ego also cannot be a mistake. Just let that sink in. If there are no mistakes, the ego cannot be a mistake. The fact of having been entrenched in one's own ego is not a mistake. And so as I've sort of in my own journey been kind of trying to understand this and coming to grips with my own ego, right? I mean, the way that I've sort of, my shorthand for understanding this is that it's kind of silly to think about it this way, but whatever, this is how I think about it. It's like, how I think about it is we as a collective, as a species, got uploaded with the ego, and we've been sort of working to integrate it properly ever since. And like if you think about how long this has been taking us, I mean, shoot, it is not an easy project. you know and if you think about like all of the lifetimes that we've spent working on this project, I mean, you start to get like a sense of the enormity of this. And then if you think about the fact that this project of integrating the ego has led us to a place where we have 8.2 billion people on this planet, where we're on the verge of ecological collapse, where we're like, I mean, I don't need to detail it for you, but if you take all of that, and if you understand that that is all sort of a necessary part of the project of integrating the ego, and if you take again that there are no mistakes, then I think you have to sort of wonder or realize that there is a role that the ego and all of its sort of attendant features are playing for us in sort of this larger scheme of the evolution of humans that maybe we haven't quite gotten a grip on. Maybe in addition to sort of having a bit more compassion for ourselves and other people as they come to grips with their own egos and come to be sort of more in right relationship with them, maybe we can come to actually have a little bit more respect for the role that the ego has played and is playing in human evolution. Hot takes by Queenie. I just want to make it clear that like this judgment of the ego, this characterization of the ego as pathological, insane, whatever, this idea that the ego is to be rejected and, the spiritual or sort of the heart-centered way is the only way, right? That the purpose of the spiritual journey is to erase the ego fully so that we can come into our sort of full divine sort of cosmic consciousness. That in itself is just an embodiment of the dualistic sort of divisive sort of logic of the ego. That is just the ego's sort of logic applied at a higher level. Like, let's come to grips with that. Look, it makes sense, right? If we've been in this moment of sort of, or sort of this place in the human evolution where we're in the ego, then it makes sense that even when we're sort of contemplating and talking about sort of spirit and and sort of our spiritual evolution, it makes sense that we would sort of use that same ego-based logic and apply it to spirituality and the spiritual journey. Let's just have compassion for ourselves for that. But let's also recognize that that's what's going on in these conversations about killing the ego. And let me pause and just like have a moment of like intellectual humility and say like, I am as far on my journey as I am right now, right? And like from from where I am, I look back and I'm like, man, I did not know what was going on. I did not know I was going to get here. Like these words that, I sort of read at whatever, or like this understanding that I had, that was so off base. And like, I'm just like so much able to now see from the expanded sort of perspective that I have now that is the case, right? So it could be that 5 years or however long from now, like further on the journey, I'm like, man, Queenie was being real dumb there, or real ignorant and naive, real sort of further down the path, or not quite as far down the path. So let me just have some humility. It very well may be the case that at some point in our sort of spiritual and sort of our spiritual evolution, that it could be that we do just merge with with cosmic consciousness, that we do just fully erase the ego. Maybe, but there's something about that doesn't seem right to me, at least as far as sort of like the human experience goes. And let me see if I can draw this out. I kind of mentioned this in the last episode, right? It's like the more I kind of get up close and personal with the divine, it's like the more I sort of understand that the divine loves paradox, right? And I kind of talked about it in the sense of like the finite merging with the infinite, and I actually am at a place now where I feel like that's sort of what the dream of humanity is. Um, which is part of why I don't see our relationship with the ego in the sense of killing it. Oftentimes, when you sort of read these mystical spiritual texts, they talk about sort of the ego dissolving. It's almost like the ego goes offline, and what happens is you just get plugged into the cosmic consciousness, basically. And I've been getting flavors of this. I'll just share some of my journey. So I don't know, maybe 5 or so years ago, after I'd gotten pretty far into like my meditation practice, I just kind of decided, I was like, look, I'm going to do kind of no mind for a while, in the sense of I am going to actively work on quieting all of these voices that are going on in my mind. And I'm sure you guys can relate to this, depending on where you're at with your journey. Like, we've all sort of realized that it's loud in there, you know. That's another thing that kind of I notice kind of starts to happen when you're like around 7 or so, right? Is like you start identifying with the thoughts, and then the thoughts just kind of persist. And there's even almost this fear sometimes of like, if the thoughts stop, then where am I? Yeah, so I really committed to this. I'm just gonna quiet it down in there. I'll just say that one of the most helpful things for me when I was doing this was kind of this grateful but no thank you kind of attitude. Right? I mean, you can't stop your thoughts, but the question is kind of like, what do you do when they're there? And so, if I notice sort of thoughts happening, it's like, okay, like, thank you. I acknowledge you, and also like, we're not doing this right now, so no thank you, and just kind of like letting it pass. Saying no, or like, just getting upset with the thoughts, like, that was not helpful. Welcoming and then letting them drift by was much more helpful. I will also just share that, like, when I was deep into this practice, I became so boring to be around. Like, I felt bad for my husband at the time, and then like anytime other people would try to spend time with me, they'd be trying to talk to me, and I'd be like, I don't have anything to say because there's nothing going on in here, and like, frankly, I'm trying to not have anything going on in here. So like, I mean, I'll listen to you, but I don't have much to reciprocate in the nature of conversation right now. So, I had this sort of extended period of like practicing no mind, right? And then sort of along with that came listening to my intuition, right? So quieting all the voices, but listening to that one, and then as well, it's like when you get really still and really quiet, in addition to sort of getting to tap into your intuition, it's like what I noticed is that the more and more I listened to my intuition, the more and more aware of sort of these internal nudges I got. And I really practiced like listening to them and feeling them. I don't know why, but an example or an analogy that's coming up is like, if you've ever played giant Jenga. First of all, super fun. I love Jenga. But based on sort of the geometry of the stack, like, there are just, what are they called? Blocks that like are wanting to come out, or at least are like freer to come out. And I mean, there should absolutely be a house rule against like touching the blocks to figure out which ones those are. But like, no one's ever enforced that rule against me. So, The way that I like to play Jenga is you just kind of just so lightly touch the side of the block and see which one just kind of slides out, right? And this is how I kind of like think about those nudges is, it's like there will be moments when it feels obvious and natural to sort of move forward or, text someone or make a decision or whatever the thing is, right? Take an action. And then there are other moments where, my internal reality is I'm like, well, I think that this wants to happen, or my expectation was that I would do this. But then when it comes to the moment of actually doing it, it's kind of a no. Like there's just this like heaviness and just this almost like lack of that forward sort of movement. Yeah. And then sort of more recently, I don't know, in the last like year or so, there is this sense that sort of I'm I, Queenie, am sort of like setting the agenda less and less. And sort of just like, I don't know if I want to say obeying orders, but it's kind of like there are things that want to be done. And I kind of have the choice to do or not. But I've gotten into sort of a place with that where I've kind of said like, no, I will. Right. And part of my sort of awakening journey, and maybe this resonates with you too, but there was a moment when I was like, oh, I've just been a sleeper agent for love. Okay. And like I'm awake now. All right, all right. So now I'm just an agent for love. That's cool. Like I'm into that. That's a fun sort of life to live. But part of doing that is being the agent, is being the one that has the physical body in this reality, that has the hands and the thumbs and, is like willing to sit down and sort of figure out like, how do I execute on this mission? You know? So, that's been kind of my experience with what I think we often will talk about as killing the ego and sort of getting more aligned with like the divine. Now, do I think I've killed my ego? I don't know that I would say that. Like, I definitely have come to feel a lot more humility. I've definitely come more to sort of understand like the connectedness of all of us and the sacredness of all of this. And also, like, I'm still me. I'm still this person that has this history, these preferences. I may have less attachment to those things, right? I don't know. I mean, people talk about ego death, and like, frankly, I've been through so many ego deaths at this point that like I've lost count. Right. Like, I just feel like I've just been like a rock in a rock tumbler, just we just tumbling over here, to the point where maybe I see another one coming. I'm like, oh, we're doing another ego death. Okay. It's going to be a little awkward for a minute. That's all right. We'll come out the other side. I know it will be beautiful. I know I'll be expanded. I know that there's a reason for this. I just have trust and faith and just tumble in to kind of expand a little bit on this concept of like being an agent for love. Again, like I actually see some of what we would dismiss as the ego as like playing a pretty critical role there, right? So I kind of pointed to this earlier about like, I use my rational mind to solve all kinds of problems in executing on my missions, right? But there's also a sense, or I've also kind of come to understand that I get certain missions because of who I am, right? My experiences, my skill set, the way that I look at a problem or understand the world. And, I mean, I'll find myself in a situation and I'll be like, gosh, why is this happening? How did I end up here? But if I think of myself in that sort of I'm an agent for love concept, and if I think about sort of what it is that I in particular bring to that situation, then it makes more sense. Then I'm like, oh, I'm here because I think about this kind of problem this way. I have this perspective. I have this skill to bring to bear here. And like another person who didn't have exactly my experiences, who didn't have my knowledge and my skills, wouldn't be able to do here what it is that I can do here. So I guess the suggestion coming out of this is like, there is also a light side to the ego, or to some of the things that we refer to as the ego. And one of the ways that I kind of think about like coming into right relationship with the ego is, how can I be friends with it? How can I communicate and show to the ego that it's not in charge, but it is still a very important sort of partner in this experience. One of the sort of revelations that came to me on my journey around this topic is like, look, the ego is not evil. It's a useful tool, but it has to understand its place, which is in service to the heart. So how I understand the sort of spiritual journey vis-a-vis the ego is not that we need to kill it, but we just need to come out of our minds into our hearts. And then we can use the ego as a tool to sort of like execute on our heart-centered missions. And I don't know, I would just encourage you to kind of contemplate that and see how that feels in your body. Does that feel better than being at war with the ego? Does that feel better than having this sort of ego/heart division, like supposedly hard kind of wired into your body? Does it feel better to think like, I don't have to reject this part of myself. I can actually be friends with it. I can actually see that it's useful and even put it to use and know that it's actually helping with my soul mission here? Chances are you have a Gmail account. Amongst the top email providers, Gmail is the most hefty data collector. Every way you interact with your Gmail account can be monitored. More concerning in today's climate, Gmail collects data from your emails, including your approximate location, your user ID, your purchase history, your photos, and your search history. If you carry cookies from other Google services, your activity can be correlated or, quote, fingerprinted from associated products such as Google Maps and YouTube. Gmail becomes a window into your entire online life because of how wide and deep their surveillance architecture goes. Practically everything you do online feeds back to Google. And in April of this year, Google signed a deal with the US Pentagon to use its artificial intelligence models for classified work. With this deal, Google joins OpenAI and Elon Musk's xAI in signing agreements worth up to $200 million to make their AI tools available on classified networks without the standard restrictions Google applies to users. Last year, Google's owner, Alphabet, lifted a ban on use of its AI for weapons and surveillance tools, explaining that, quote, AI had become important for protecting national security. So if you're ready to stop handing over your data for free to a company and a government who has shown no hesitation to use AI-powered surveillance for violence, let me introduce you to Proton Mail. Proton Mail is based in Switzerland, which has some of the world's strongest privacy laws. Proton Mail uses end-to-end encryption, which blocks all trackers and encrypts your messages so only you can read them. A lawyer friend once told me that when she sees that a person has a Proton Mail address, she knows she'll never be able to subpoena their emails. You can get a free email address from Proton Mail, or their Mail Plus subscription starts at $4.99 per month. With Mail Plus, you get up to 10 email addresses, support for one custom domain, and up to 15 gigabytes of storage. As an email power user, I really appreciate the ability to have one inbox for all of my addresses. And the folders, labels, and filters help me organize my inbox in a way that really satisfies my OCD nature. And their easy switch feature makes switching from Gmail nearly effortless. Are you ready to stop feeding your personal information to a surveillance-hungry government? Then use the link in the show notes below and you'll get your Proton Mail account for $1 for the first month, or $3 per month when you sign up for an annual plan. Okay, New Humans fam, let's get back into the episode. I think that if we look at the wider sort of context of what's been going on in human evolution and the evolution of human consciousness, right, and this planet, this Earth school, that the fact of the ego actually starts to make sense. So I tried to find this passage for you guys so I could reference the book it was, but I couldn't find it. I thought it was this book on sort of ancient Egyptian cosmology I've been looking through recently, but I either didn't mark the passage or I didn't see it, or I don't know. It doesn't matter. I might just link the book in the show notes anyways, because that book has been just like blowing my mind. So, just like I'm going to spread the good word. But this passage that I saw, it really kind of connected the dots for me as far as sort of the role that the ego plays in the sort of larger picture of human consciousness. So in this passage, it sort of outlined sort of these three main sort of steps of human evolution, right? I know there's lots of steps, but these were like the three sort of major ones. And the idea was that we started as pure matter. Matthias de Stefano talks about this, right? He talks about man as humans coming from humus or from mud or the earth, right? And I think sort of we're getting more and more sort of awareness of that interconnectedness, of that fact that initially, at any rate, we came from Earth. But then this passage goes on to say, right, that in the sort of larger scheme and plan of the evolution of humans from Earth to spiritual humans, that there's this sort of in-between step that needed to happen, which is rational man, Homo sapiens. And the reason that that middle step is needed, according to this passage, is that in order to get onto spirit from being pure matter, humans needed to develop and come to understand abstract thinking. Because, think about it, spirit is not something that you can observe with your eyes. Right? It's not material inherently. What this passage is suggesting was that in order to come to a place in our evolution and our development where we could even begin to contemplate, where we could even begin to have sort of an experience of spirit, we first needed to understand abstraction. And it was in sort of the intellect, in rational thought, in sort of our minds getting all trapped up in there, that we were able to develop the capacity for that abstraction so that we can take that next step into becoming spiritual human, or Homo spiritus. And that transition, I believe, and I know other people believe as well, that transition is exactly what I think is happening right now. And it's really exciting. And we can see this shift actually being mirrored in all kinds of different ways and aspects of sort of our study of this reality and what it is to be human. I know that both in the sciences and in philosophy, for instance, we're like starting to talk more and more and sort of understand that like consciousness imbues everything. And there's a lot of different names for it, right? But nonetheless, like we're just starting to sort of see through all of these different lenses, spirit everywhere. I think if we come to understand the ego and the situation that we're in as a result of the ego. And if we think about all of the lifetimes that have had to be lived in order to work on integrating the ego in ourselves and in the collective. And if we think about sort of the point that we're at right now, and if we understand, if we contextualize all of that as part of this plan, this dream, this evolution of humans from matter to spiritual beings, I mean, from my perspective, it's beautiful. And, it's like the role that the ego has played for us and is playing for us. To kind of go back to the observation that motivated this oral book report I'm doing, right? It's like the rejection of the ego very well may be exactly what it is that's keeping us in this sort of quote unquote pathological state as a result of the ego, right? Because we're rejecting it. We haven't figured out how it fits into the greater whole. We haven't figured out what the gifts are from the ego. I think that if we can come to have some respect for it, if we can come to have some gratitude, if we can come to understand that actually, this thing that we thought was a mistake was actually the very thing that's helping to bring us, elevate us to merge with the divine. And that's beautiful, right? And if we also understand further, right, if we take seriously the idea that everything here is divinely orchestrated, then we also then have to realize that the ego is divinely orchestrated as well. It's all part of the plan. And something that has just become more and more sort of obvious to me, though difficult to articulate, is that this existence is just a love story. I guess I've come to understand this more and more as just the unfolding of the story in which we come to merge with the divine. And if you think about all of the lifetimes, if you think about all of the effort and all of the suffering and everything that we've had to overcome, and also all of the beauty that happens here and in our lifetimes, we have this tendency to focus on the bad and the suffering, and, I don't want to trivialize any of that. And there are reasons for that as well. For one, like, the ego loves it. The ego likes to suffer. And also it's a means of control, right? And the ego also likes control. And nonetheless, this planet, this existence, these lives contain immense beauty. This planet that we live on, I've said this before, but this planet that we live on is a fully immersive, ever-changing art installation. And we get to live in it and play with it. But when you take all of that and you put it in the context of the plan is for humans, for the finite to merge with the infinite, it's just like the most epic love story there ever was. And those moments when you break through, those moments when you get just a little taste of that expanded consciousness when you get to feel just that plugged inness to the divine, to cosmic consciousness, you get a little taste of what it is to merge. It makes it all worth it. All of it's worth it. And maybe more to the point is it's just the most incredible feeling. To actually hold the feeling of unconditional love in your being. So where does that leave us? I think it's this. So we're in this moment of just incredible transformation. We're in this moment where we are literally stepping into, I believe, the next phase of human evolution. More and more people are waking up. More and more people are stepping into Homo spiritus. It's real fun. And I think, it's just going to accelerate as we sort of get further and further into this moment and this sort of next evolutionary phase. I think as more and more people start to wake up and become self-aware and start getting more and more of that sort of flavor of the finite merging with the infinite and vice versa. Once you have that, it's like the question kind of becomes like, how do I cultivate that? How do I make that more of my reality, more of my day to day? How do I stretch myself into this? And I talked a little bit before about sort of the practice that I did with trying to just live in no mind as much as possible. But the thing, I think sort of the other side of it, besides quieting the mind, is coming into the heart. And something that was really helpful for me in my journey with doing this was actually consciously trying to just put my attention from my head into my heart. And when I first started doing this, and if you've never done this before and you want to practice and try it, that felt really silly to me to begin with, because I had been so used to being in my mind that trying to put my attention anywhere else in my body felt weird and illogical, right? But try it. And sort of as you practice, you'll start to feel more awareness. Like that awareness will start to wake up. Something that I found really helpful was actually just putting my hand over my heart and just kind of having that physical reminder of this is where my awareness is, or this is where I'm trying to put my awareness, whether that just be while I'm sitting or I really love to do it in the mornings and in the evenings, particularly when your mind is still either quieter because you're just waking up, or if you're working on going to sleep and sort of quieting your mind, then it's a really nice and powerful time to do it. It feels really nice just right now. The other thing too is check in with your heart. I mean, we are so practiced at sort of asking what's on our minds and what's on your heart. How does my heart feel today? Is a question you might ask yourself. What does my heart have to say about the situation? And sort of the more and more, again, that you practice doing that and checking in, the more and more it will start to, I'll just say talk to you, but the heart is a brain of its own, right? I'll just say that. Yeah. The heart is its own brain. So, as you practice checking in with it and putting your awareness there and listening to what it has to say, that connection will become more active for you. And after several years, my experience has been that I actually just kind of live here now, and it's not to say that I don't ever get back into my head. That for sure happens. But what I've been noticing more recently is that I can palpably tell the difference now between when I'm in a heart-centered place versus when I'm in a mind-centered place. It just feels different, and the kinds of thought patterns and things that happen are also different. And so if and when you develop that awareness, then you can be oh, I know what's happened. I know why I'm having this kind of thought. It's because I'm in my head. But so let me just take a second. I'll put my hand over my heart. I'll take a deep breath and I'll just get back into my heart-centered place. And then we can sort of move on from a more grounded, nicer place. It seems to me that the situation that we find ourselves in is essentially asking us a question. Hey, humans, you see now what it is to live in separation. You see the result of living in alienation. You see what happens when you just consider yourself and disregard the needs of the plants, the animals, the planet, other humans. And I feel like the question or the challenge that's being presented to us now is, it's almost like, are you going to keep going that way? Or are you going to wake up? Are you going to realize to yourself, or just like say to yourself, like, we can't keep going this way. We have to try something else. And that something else involves the collective. It involves realizing that I am not the only one that matters. And it involves stepping into the sacred and the spiritual. It involves stepping into becoming Homo spiritus. And part of that, is like taking steps to sort of adopt or move into that spiritual worldview. And like, there is a distance between those two places, but it's not impossible. Everything is on our side. And, it may just require some effort, some new practices, building new habits, asking yourself, okay, what does a person who understands the sacredness of everything, how does that person move through the world? What do I need to do? What kind of practices do I need to bring into my day-to-day so that I'm living in a more heart-centered place as opposed to a mind-centered place? How does a person who understands that she is just one of many, how does she approach her life? How would she approach this situation? How would she act now? And these things initially, you might feel like you're kind of faking it. But over time, as you start developing that conversation with your heart, as you allow that sort of expanded consciousness to expand, it'll stop feeling like you're faking it. And you'll start to feel more and more like that agent of love that you are. Anyways, New Humans fam, thank you so much for joining me for this episode of the New Humans for New Earth podcast. I'm Queenie, your host. If you found this episode to be inspirational, helpful, or informative, please share it to your social media and tag us. Share it with your friends, your partner, a family member, or anyone that you love. If you loved this episode, please leave a review. And be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast. This is how we help grow the New Humans community and inspire others to join us in co-creating New Earth. This world is what we make it. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next episode.